Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Conspiracy theories seem, to me at least, to be an increasingly prevalent feature of public discourse. No sooner has some significant event taken place, but the internet is full of alternative explanations for that event, involving hidden and nefarious decision makers. These theories run the gamut from the wildly outlandish to the somewhat plausible, and your view may differ on where the line should be drawn. There are a number of questions about the rationality of conspiracy theories, whether we should reject them wholesale as irrational, for example, or consider each one on its merits. But there are also some interesting ethical questions. And philosophers, including Patrick Stokes, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Deakin University in Melbourne, have been increasingly turning their attention to these questions. What are the moral costs of accusing someone of being a conspiracy theorist? But also, what are the moral costs of accusing someone of being a conspirator? In what ways might conspiracy theorising be corrosive of trust? And how should we respond to people we know who believe conspiracy theories? I really enjoyed this conversation with Professor Stokes on the line from Australia, on what I think is a really important topic which needs some philosophical attention. Patrick, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
No problem. So we're here to talk about conspiracy theories. So I thought maybe to start, because we're going to be talking about conspiracy theories kind of in the context of the way they've been discussed by academics, and a lot of our listeners won't be familiar with that kind of debate. So I wondered if you could start by just kind of giving us a sketch of how academics in general have sort of thought about conspiracy theories and discussed conspiracy theories, but also kind of, because it's been debated in different, academic disciplines, what the differences are between those disciplines.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's really interesting that there is quite a vibrant literature on conspiracy theory among the sociologists, the psychologists, anthropologists. So there is a sort of an attempt to understand conspiracy theory as a sociological phenomenon, as a kind of socio-political response to particular kinds of condition, and also to understand the history of it. So there's some interesting work that's been done trying to explain where the modern conspiracy theory as a recognizable thing actually originates. And so there's a particular story that, for instance, sociologists like Jovan Byford have talked about, which says that conspiracy theory, as we understand it now, basically goes back to the French Revolution. It comes out of particular kind of elite worries about the French Revolution and the power structures that emerged from that.
Right.
And it sort of picks up on certain kind of contemporary, what's the word I'm looking for here? Contemporary sort of prejudices or anxieties about groups like Freemasons and Illuminati and so on. And it sort of builds those into these big, grand, elaborate conspiracies.
That's interesting because, sorry to interrupt.
No, go.
I did read a book that kind of traced conspiracy theories back as far as the Roman Empire and said actually like the earliest known conspiracy theories were about the Emperor Nero, right? So the idea that Nero burned Rome down and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, this is where, part of the problem is that sociologists are trying to look for a very particular kind of recognizable social phenomenon, right? So what you and I mean when we talk about conspiracy theories, when we say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. Because the interesting thing is, and this is where this sort of foreshadows some of what the philosophers have said, but the interesting thing is that we all agree and we all admit that history is full of people acting in conspiratorial ways, right? For instance, Julius Caesar was murdered by a conspiracy of his peers. Watergate happened, right? We accept these things, but none of us really think of those as conspiracy theories. We tend to think of those, that's not a conspiracy theory, that's just an historical statement of what happened. So there's more going on in the term conspiracy theory than just an explanation in terms of conspiracy.
Sure.
And sociologists, if you like, are trying to work with that thicker sense of what they mean by conspiracy theory, but they don't necessarily, and this applies to other disciplines too, but they don't necessarily explain fully what they mean by that
Yeah.
But it's clearly a normative term. It's clearly weighted, right? It's clearly a pejorative term. Right. So there's an interesting kind of set of assumptions built into a lot of that literature where conspiracy theories are it's almost like the old, obscenity thing. I know it when I see it. It's how do you know something's pornography? I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
And a lot of the philosophers who have come to this, not all, but a lot of them have pushed back on that and said, well, first of all, you need to define terms, right? If we're going to talk about conspiracy theories and we're going to try and work out what, if anything, is bad about them, which seems to be a standing assumption in these other disciplines, then we need to know what we're talking about. And so philosophers have come in and said, okay, let's come up with a definition of conspiracy theory. The simplest one is just an explanation of observed events in terms of two or more actors working in secret to bring those events about. Right? That's about the simplest definition of conspiracy theory you can have. Now, as with any philosophical definition, it both lets too much in and excludes a bunch of stuff, right? So in this case, it lets too much in particular. So it's like, okay, so Watergate then is a conspiracy theory, but also the standard story about 9/11 is a conspiracy theory, right? It's a conspiracy on the part of Al-Qaeda to conduct terrorist attacks in the continental United States. So in that sense, we could look at that and say, well, if that's what we mean by conspiracy theory, surely that definition is too loose because it's letting in all these things that we don't talk about when we talk about conspiracy theory. Okay, let's try and put something else in to make the definition more precise. And this is where philosophers have basically argued that pretty much anything you put in is going to end up being too much. Right. So the closest one that some of them seem to almost agree on is that conspiracy theories also contradict an official narrative. That doesn't necessarily work because, of course, very early on in the piece, there may not yet be an official narrative. And we saw with things like the Boston bombings, for instance, the Boston Marathon bombings, that sometimes the conspiracy theories start before the official narrative has even appeared, right? So before anyone in authority has said, okay, here's what we reckon happened, there's already conspiracy theories in the ether. So, but that's one thing. Another one that's sometimes suggested is conspiracy theories have some sort of malevolent purpose. So this basically comes down to, do you think that organizing a surprise party is a kind of conspiracy theory or is a kind of conspiracy? Some philosophers of conspiracy, like M. Dentith, who I dare say I'll be talking about a bit today, just bite the bullet and say, yeah, basically organizing a birthday party is a conspiracy, and that's fine. You can have a conspiracy to do a good thing. So there is this attempt to sort of try and make more precise what we mean by conspiracy theory among philosophers. And I think all that's pretty valuable because, of course, there's a lot of stuff you can hide behind that sort of hand-waving of, well, we know it when we see it, right?
Yeah.
There's a risk of a certain kind of for one thing, there's a risk of a certain kind of chauvinism, right? So one example that people often use is Stalin's show trials. Pretty much everyone now accepts that these trials were all rigged. This was Stalin just basically purging a bunch of people he wanted out of the way for various reasons. None of them had done any of the things that they were accused of. At the time, that was a somewhat controversial position among Western left-wing intellectuals who wanted to insist that Stalin wouldn't do that. But now it's pretty much clear, right? They were rigged. We all kind of accept that. But it's interesting that then we're much warier about believing conspiracies might be afoot in our own countries, in our own context. There's a certain kind of chauvinism that can happen because we might think that, well, conspiracies are the sort of things that could happen over there, but not in our thriving open liberal democracy, right? So there's that worry, but there's also this worry too that, as people like Charles Pigden and Lee Basham and others have said, is that the way we treat the way we assume there's something automatically wrong with conspiracy theories can be used to provide political cover, right, for bad actors. So, again, one example I use is when it was put to Tony Blair that you're invading Iraq for the sake of oil, aren't you, rather than weapons, his response was, oh, well, that's just a conspiracy theory, right, which is meant to then say that doesn't need to be taken seriously or investigated any further. So it can be used, and we'll probably get onto that a bit later, but that is, I think, a useful kind of worry. And I think a lot of the philosophy literature has been really useful on this. But it also does go in surprising places because it does tend to say, for the most part, and there are important exceptions, but for the most part, they tend to say, well, if a conspiracy theory is just an explanation of observed events in terms of two or more actors working in secret to bring that outcome about, there's nothing inherently illogical in believing in those. And indeed, there can't be, because we know that actual conspiracies meeting that definition have happened. Watergate happened. Pigden said at one point, every historically literate person is a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
Right? Because we all believe at least some of these things have happened. And yet, there's people like me and there's other philosophers like Kassam and others who want to insist that there's still something wrong with conspiracy theory. And to me, there's something about conspiracy theorizing as a practice which is problematic. So it doesn't necessarily mean that any conspiracy theory is necessarily going to be wrong, but it does mean that the actual practice of constructing conspiracy theories needs to be very carefully investigated.
Sure. Thank you. And that debate that you refer to there among philosophers, it's kind of primarily been a debate about whether conspiracy theorizing in general is irrational, right? So it's a debate between what's called generalists, who think that kind of in general there's something irrational about conspiracy theories and about people who believe conspiracy theories, and particularists who say, no, there's nothing in general wrong with it. Some conspiracy theories are irrational, some aren't, but we need to kind of take them on a case-by-case basis and evaluate each one. So, why do you think there's been that focus on the rationality of conspiracy theories, and do you think that misses anything out?
I think it's largely a function of the fact that most of the debate within philosophy has taken place in epistemology. So it's mostly been... a lot of it sort of has been in social epistemology, but the assumption has been that you get the epistemology right, and then whatever normative consequences from that are downstream of that. So whatever the sort of moral or ethical dimensions are, you've got to get the epistemology nailed down first.
Just for our listeners, just to clarify, epistemology is basically like the study of knowledge and belief and things like that, right? So
yeah, exactly.
In this case, it's kind of evaluating people's beliefs and knowledge for their rationality. Yeah.
So a lot of the discussion of conspiracy theory in the bulk of the philosophy literature, and I have to say it's not a massive literature by any means, but it's a lot of the same people working on this. Which is surprising to me, given that it is such a big topic and it's bigger in the broad literature. Philosophers haven't had a huge amount to say about it, but what they have said has been mostly in that epistemological vein. It's mostly been about what sort of beliefs are these, or what sort of theories are these? Are they even theories? How do they operate on a theoretical level? Is there anything about conspiracy beliefs that is inherently irrational that would allow us to say, well, that's a conspiracy theory, therefore I don't need to take it seriously? Now, all of these philosophers will say straight up that many conspiracy theories are obviously a bit bonkers on their face, right? A lot of them are clearly just absurd, right? And that's okay. They might be absurd, they might be irrational, they might be internally self-contradictory, or they might just be hopelessly undermotivated. But what they're arguing is that the very act of explaining in terms of a conspiracy is not inherently irrational in itself. And I think that's, as I say, even though I've got my disagreements with a lot of the people in the literature, I think that is a valuable intervention into these discussions, because once you see that, a lot of the discussion that happens in other disciplines does start to look a little loose. It does start to look like there's an assumption that we all know what conspiracy theories are, we all know they're bad, what do we do about it? And then suddenly you're reading people like, Sustain and Vermeulen arguing, for instance, well, the government should be paying people to sneak into chat rooms and debunk conspiracy theories, which is kind of, operating on a level of irony I can barely begin to get my head around.
So we should conspire in order to stop conspiracy theories. We should conspire against them.
Yeah, I'm hoping they've thought that one through again, to be honest.
As you say, a lot of this debate's been about epistemology, so it's been about like the rationality of the beliefs. But you say in a paper that you've recently written about this that there's been a normative turn recently in philosophizing about conspiracy theories. So what do you mean by that, and what forms the normative turn taken?
So there's always been some normative discussion in the literature on this. So, as we've already mentioned, for instance, providing political cover to bad actors by using the term conspiracy theory to shut down conversation. That's always kind of been there. But there's been a bit more discussion recently in terms of sort of what's sometimes called epistemic justice. That is the way in which we shut down certain people from claims to make, or from making claims to knowledge, or for having their claims taken seriously. So, for instance, there's been some work done recently, just in that special issue, for instance, that paper was in, you just mentioned. There's some interesting work on discourse analysis and the way in which the term conspiracy theory functions as what's called a conversational excitative, which is to say it basically ejects somebody from the conversation. It basically says, well, you're just a conspiracy theorist, or that's just a conspiracy theory. When you say that, it means we don't need to take this seriously. We can simply move on. And there's pushback against that, partly on epistemological grounds. As you say, there's this distinction between generalists and particularists, and the generalists just want to say, if it's a conspiracy theory, we don't need to know anything else. We can just leave it there. We can just say that's obviously not true because it's a conspiracy theory, move on. The particularist wants to say, no, it may well be rubbish, but we can't just dismiss it because it's a conspiracy theory. We have to look at least a little bit further. Yeah. And that troubles me, just as an aside, because, of course, a lot of conspiracy theories, for instance, have anti-Semitic roots, even if they're not obviously anti-Semitic on their face. A lot of them actually come out of anti-Semitic theories. So it's kind of like, well, as soon as you start investigating, you're starting to participate in a dodgy practice. So there's interesting questions there. But this normative turn, I think, is largely about conversational justice, about who gets to have their views taken seriously, in the way that we talk about conspiracy theory. Is that somehow kind of disqualifying to a range of people to have their views listened to? All of which I think is interesting and important stuff, and it is all relevant. And it's I don't by any means think it's the whole picture, but I do think it is relevant.
Yeah. So I completely agree, and that thought about kind of the suggestion that we have to take theories on a case-by-case basis. We should take them all seriously and we should kind of investigate them. When I read that, I had the same thought that you did, including the really horrible ones, right? Including the anti-Semitic ones or the, otherwise racist ones or whatever. Like, are we kind of, in some way sort of morally compromising ourselves by actually taking those seriously in the way that's suggested? That did seem significant to me. And also just the fact that, that kind of normative, by which in this context we basically mean ethical, turn that you've described there, that does seem, as you say, to pick out something that's important, right? It is a bad thing to kind of shut people down by calling them conspiracy theorists, and there may well be some conspiracy theorizing where people are actually onto something, right? That seems bad. But it doesn't seem like that's the most important ethical concern about, related to conspiracy theorizing, right? It seems like a lot of these theories are quite damaging, quite corrosive to society in general in various ways. And could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting point. So, again, some of the philosophers who've worked on this have said there's nothing necessarily the case with conspiracy theory that it will cause these sort of downstream harms. That is to say, it's neither necessary for people to do bad things that they believe conspiracy theories, nor is it sufficient. So there are conspiracy theorists who don't run around doing horrible things, and you can do horrible things without believing conspiracy theories. But it is also the case that conspiracy theories can license people to do things like harassing the parents of Sandy Hook shooting victims, for instance, which we've seen it extensively. And there was Alex Jones has lost that court case around that recently. The guy who went to a pizza restaurant and with a gun demanding to basically see where the Pizzagate conspiracy was being hatched. And of course, the other thing too is it's really hard to actually refute these. So the guy who did that got in there, shot open a door or whatever, went in, was like, oh, okay, it's actually just a restaurant. There's nothing. And he's since admitted, that there was nothing to that conspiracy theory. And yet, just as we're having this conversation, Elon Musk has just retweeted
I was going to say,
a thing about that, saying, as if it's legit. And then he's deleted that again. So maybe someone got in his ear. But there is a kind of there are certain kinds of harm that conspiracy theories do seem to engender, and certain kinds of recognizable patterns of harm around that. You could also argue that conspiracy theories corrode certain kinds of trust, or particularly trust in certain kinds of epistemic authorities, right? So, and you might think, oh, well, that's fine. Shouldn't we be working all this stuff out for ourselves and decide for ourselves what we believe? And that's true. But the reality is that most of what we know on the basis of testimony, what we get from other people. And we live in a condition of an extraordinary amount of knowledge that exists, but necessarily that knowledge is distributed across a range of different actors and things. No one can have everything in their head anymore. So you have to which means we are increasingly reliant upon epistemic experts of various sorts. And also different kinds of institutions like the media, academia, industry, to an extent, government. And there's a tension here, right, which is we need to rely on all of these because, otherwise we can't really know anything. But equally, all of these at various times have shown themselves to be less than 100% trustworthy in various ways, right? All of them have done bad things. Sure. So there's this interesting kind of tension there that on the one hand, healthy liberal democracy requires a kind of standing suspicion of power. On the other hand, I think actual social life, life among other people requires us to assume that most of the time most people mean us well, or at least don't mean us any harm. And most of what everyone says is true. Communication itself falls apart if people are not truthful almost all of the time and lies are somehow exceptional. So there's an interesting kind of tension there. But yeah, so there's these harms around the corrosion of trust, which are in there. There's a certain kind of coarsening of discourse, you might say, that comes with a lot of conspiracy theory as well. But I also think there's just a harm in conspiracy theory, which is that indulging in conspiracy theory, really following it through enthusiastically, involves accusing more and more people of wrongdoing, right? You can't actually have a conspiracy theory without making an accusation. And accusations, to my mind, are not morally neutral. Every accusation comes with a certain kind of moral cost, which needs to be recouped with evidence.
Okay, so what do you mean by that? That accusations aren't morally neutral and that they carry a moral cost?
So, in that paper on the normative turn that you mentioned, I engaged with an earlier example in the literature about a woman named Maureen who is having an affair, and her friend says to her, well, why don't you just come clean about what you've been doing? And as soon as you posit that, by positing that as a possibility, it changes the character of the conversation. It opens up the conversation. It suddenly means there are different possibilities that are now in play and so on. But I then want to flip that around and say, okay, now imagine Maureen's partner, let's say Maurice, is thinking they're wondering why his wife is acting so strangely lately, what's going on. And then his friend says, Maury, you don't think there could be someone else, do you? Right? Now, as soon as you posit that, you've also opened up the conversation in that interesting way, right? You've changed things. You've added a new possibility. But what you've also done is you've impugned Maureen. You've made it, it's at least possible that she could be doing this, right? It's at least thinkable that she's the sort of person who would do that. Now, in this particular case, it turns out Maureen is actually doing that. But at the same time, just raising the possibility somehow changes the moral calculation. It adds something, and you sort of can't take it back either, right? Like as soon as you say it's thinkable, it suddenly it's been thought, so to speak, and so you can't then sort of go back on that. Now, in the case of conspiracy theory, some conspiracy theories are around agents where they've got a pretty poor track record or whatever else. So, like, if there's a coup somewhere and I say, the CIA is involved in this, you might say, well, looking back on the CIA's record, that's not the wackiest thing anyone's ever suggested. It's, okay. On the other hand, look at, say, some of the conspiracy theories around, say, the death of Princess Diana, right? So you had all these conspiracy theories that ranged from, dark, shadowy forces, which were never actually defined at all, just, some sort of establishment in the background, all the way through to Prince Philip did it, right? Yeah. So really specific, personalized.
Yeah.
So that's all, and that is, I think, there's a moral cost to that accusation. Saying of someone, I think this person could commit murder and did, has a moral weight to it and a moral cost to it. Now, I'm not saying that the late Duke of Edinburgh was sitting there reading conspiracy theory blogs in the middle of the night and weeping into his whiskey. I'm not suggesting that, he was that he actually suffered particular harm. What I am suggesting is there is nonetheless a moral cost to that accusation.
Yes.
And I mean, so does that mean you can never make accusation? Well, again, things wouldn't work very well socially if we never made accusations. If somebody's, if I wake up in the middle of the night, I go downstairs and there's someone there carrying off my television, if it's not like I'm morally obliged to say, "Oh, you lost my poor fellow."
Sure.
I'm allowed to say, "Please stop stealing my television."
Yeah.
But there has to be, particularly when we're talking about things that are not well evidenced, some sort of kind of reluctance there. And I think that's particularly the case when you're talking about conspiracy theories, which tend to be very hard to falsify.
Right.
It's very, very hard to disprove a conspiracy theory,
right.
and which also by their nature tend to multiply accusations.
Yes.
So Steve Clark at Charles Sturt University has done some interesting work on this using the framework of the 20th century philosopher of science Imre Lakatos. And Lakatos says, well, a theory is kind of a core set of propositions, if you like, about how something works. And then, of course, you'll get disconfirming evidence, which goes against the theory. So now we don't just chuck out our theories the moment we get a single bit of disconfirming evidence, right? Rather, what you do is you build in a series of ad hoc, what are called auxiliary hypotheses, right? Extra bits of theory, if you like, that protects the main theory. Yeah. And if those extra bits of theory are helping you make more successful predictions, then the theory is getting stronger, right? So, and Lakatos called this a progressive research program. On the other hand, if you're just adding in more and more of these auxiliary hypotheses, and they're not actually making the theory stronger, they're not helping it to make more predictions, that you're just making the theory more and more bloated with ad hoc stuff,
right?
There just to keep it afloat. Then we have what he calls a degenerative research program. And Clark's argument is that most conspiracy theories are degenerative research programs. So take and there's actually some controversy over whether we should even use this example in the conspiracy theory literature. Some people think it's putting a thumb on the scales. But take the belief that NASA faked the moon landing.
Right.
I like using it actually because it's nice, it's clear, and it's relatively politically clean. Like there's no real it's not as clean as Elvis faked his own death, but it's pretty clean. Other people say don't use it because it's so obviously wacky. Well, I don't know, but if you take the theory NASA faked the moon landings, you're automatically accusing a bunch of people of lying to the world, including all the astronauts involved and all the technicians at NASA in the 60s and 70s. Okay. Bit of disconfirmatory evidence comes along in, say, 2009. Lunar orbiters take photos of the surface of the moon. Lo and behold, there's the Apollo 11 landing site. We can see it from orbit. Look at these photos. The photos become a bit of disconfirmatory evidence. Okay, so if you want to defend your theory here, you need an auxiliary hypothesis. Our auxiliary hypothesis is going to be the photos were faked. So NASA is still faking the moon landings 50 years on, and they've still got their department of, fakery or whatever going on to continue the conspiracy, right? So now we're accusing a whole bunch of extra people, because presumably the people doing Photoshop at NASA in 2009 are not the people doing the original moon landing in the 60s.
Yeah.
So we're accusing more people. Okay, is this auxiliary hypothesis actually helping the theory? Does it make any further predictions? Well, no, because no one's found any evidence of there being such an ongoing effort to Photoshop this stuff or whatever else. But the thing is, to kind of protect the theory, you have to build in more and more of these. As more and more people contradict your theory, you've got to start saying, well, they're in on it or they're duped by it or whatever else. So you've got to keep multiplying these accusations. Yes. So these very quickly become very morally expensive theories, so to speak. Yeah. Just to keep them afloat, you've got to keep calling more and more people conspirators. Not always the case for every conspiracy theory, but I think it is generally recognizably true of a lot of conspiracy theories that they do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I suppose the kinds of cases that really bring home those moral costs of conspiracy theories are things like the Sandy Hook conspiracy, right? So, like, as you said earlier, there have been cases of these grieving parents being harassed by people who believe that they're crisis actors and so on, and
that their children never existed, or they're being paid by the government. And that's the thing; those harms flow from an auxiliary hypothesis, right? So it's kind of like, the parents. There's also a chap called Gene Rosen who sheltered a bunch of the students when they turned up in his driveway.
Right.
He just lived near the school, and then he started getting emails and calls from people saying, how much were you paid by the government to lie about all this and all that stuff. Now you could say again, those accusations are not a core part of the theory, which is that the government staged it. They're actually an auxiliary hypothesis. If these people come along and say, I saw the kids, they were really traumatized, well, they must be lying. They must be in on it. So the additional kind of accusations occur as a result of that.
Yeah, so you initially want to accuse, politicians or the government or whatever. I think the idea is that the shootings were staged in order to kind of justify greater gun control, right? So you've got this kind of political agenda which is driving the initial conspiracy theory, but in order to make the theory make sense, you end up having to widen the net of people who you're accusing of being in on it, and it eventually, it's going to include people who are themselves in quite vulnerable positions.
Exactly. I mean, this is the thing, and I mean, one of the things about conspiracy theories is that on paper they're kind of fun. Like it's fun to just construct conspiracy theories. It means that the news is much more interesting if there's a whole bunch of complicated backstories all going on. And there's also something faintly comforting about conspiracy theory, right? The idea that there's a small number of bad actors pulling the strings is, even though it's a really dark, sinister sort of scenario, it's still in a way more comforting than the idea that there are no strings, that everything is just a bunch of random badness that happens and that no one in theory could control it. So there's something kind of comforting about conspiracy theories, something weirdly optimistic even about conspiracy theories. If only we could take the bad guys out and replace them with good guys, then everything would be okay again.
Yeah.
But then people follow these things through, and suddenly, you're contacting the parent of a dead child to say your kid never existed. I mean, that's messed up. I'm sorry, but it is. And at some point, something needs to have triggered there to go, no, hang on. No, I'm not doing this.
Yeah.
But if you're just following the logic of the theory through, then it makes a kind of internal sense, I guess.
So, taking these points on board then, how does that affect how we should think about conspiracy theories then? So does this affect this kind of debate about, should we treat conspiracy theories in general as irrational or as, something that there's something wrong with? Or do we take them on a case-by-case basis? How does that affect how we should, what kind of stance we should take to conspiracy theories?
Yeah, so, I mean, the problem is, on the one hand, we have this sense that there is a socially recognizable phenomenon that we call conspiracy theory, which has various kinds of harms associated with it. On the other hand, we also accept that actual conspiracies of various types have occurred. One problem we have here, too, is that there's no real way of knowing how frequent those events really are, because by definition they're hidden, right? So there's a set of, if you like, unfalsifiable assumptions about how conspired the world is.
Sure.
M. Dentith has made this point. So the position I've argued for, and I admit it's kind of a fairly unstable halfway house position, but the position that I've argued for is what I've called reluctant particularism, or defeasible generalism, right? Which is to say that we can admit that conspiracy theories do happen. We can also say that these events are likely to be very rare and unlikely, and there are huge moral costs to positing them. And therefore, really, you should only go positing a conspiracy theory when the evidence has got to the point where it's kind of unavoidable.
Yeah.
So again, going downstairs and finding a guy carrying out my TV, at that point, it's fairly strong evidence.
Yes.
There's that line from Henry David Thoreau, some circumstantial evidence is very strong as when you find a trout in the milk, which everyone's like, what? And then it turns out he's actually saying that in the 19th century they used to water down milk for sale. So he was suggesting that that's what that means. Yeah. But yeah, so I've always wondered about that. But so it's not that you can never, under any circumstances, posit a conspiracy theory, but and there are certain circumstances in which it may well be likely. Like, I mean, if you see certain activity characteristic of mafia activity in a place where there's a lot of mafia activity going on, it's probably not that unreasonable. But the further the further a conspiracy theory, if you like, departs from how we understand the world and our immediate circumstances to be, the more accusations involved and the higher the moral cost of positing it. I think all of that should make us more and more wary of taking it seriously as a candidate for the truth. And I think, sometimes we'll have to accept that there are conspiracies, but I think it should be a rare and reluctant event.
Yeah. And I don't know how much kind of response there's been to that view that you've put forward yet, but I mean, it strikes me that sounds like a really good response if you believe, as you said there, that the instances of real conspiracies on this kind of level are pretty rare, right? And I think you make the point in the paper that it seems sometimes like there is actually, like, underneath this disagreement at the level of theory and definition and so on, there's actually a kind of disagreement about how common conspiracies actually are, right? So, I mean, I guess if some of the people who are writing about this actually just disagree with you that conspiracies are as rare as you say, they might want to push back on that idea that we should be quite so reluctant to kind of entertain conspiracy theories.
Yeah, so some philosophical work's been done on this in terms of what are called blicks. So there's a thing that goes back to, I think it was R.M. Hare, argued that, we have these fundamental assumptions about the way the world is that then determine what evidence we will or won't take as evidence. Goes back to, I think it's Flu's example of the, if you know this example in philosophy of religion of the gardener, the invisible gardener, where it's like two explorers come into a forest glade, and they see some flowers and some weeds, and one of them says, there must be a gardener who tends this plot lovingly, and the other one says, no, there's no gardener, it's just all random. So they set up a watch, but they never see a gardener appear, so then they set up a fence and bloodhounds and an electric fence, and it gets more and more elaborate, but they never find any sign of a gardener being there. And in the end, one of them says, "No, but there is a gardener. It's just that he's invisible. He's he's impervious to electric shocks. He gives like no scent." And then the first one's like, "Well, how is your invisible, insensible gardener any different to there not being a gardener at all?" Right? So, but the point is, you've just got two fundamental assumptions that will determine what will or won't count as just confirming evidence. And in the same sort of way, I think that a lot of what goes on in conspiracy theory is these fundamental background assumptions about what sort of things can and can't happen, or what sort of things are likely to be true. And I mean, this is the thing. There is this disagreement among philosophers that rarely gets explicitly thematized. It's normally just sort of there in the background of these discussions. On the surface level, the discussions are all about epistemology. But in the background, there's this set of disagreements about, Well, the government wouldn't do that. It wouldn't stage 9/11 versus, you'd never know what those devious bastards will do, right? So it's this sort of like, there's these sort of basically unfalsifiable assumptions, I think, that are working in the background. And I mean, so some of the philosophers that work on this, I think some of them have said, of my view, well, that's really just particularism, so I'm not even sure we're disagreeing here. Others have said, have sort of implied, but you're also being kind of naive because people conspire about stuff all the time. So, so I think fundamentally there's some assumptions that work on the same sort of level as things like there's a little bit of good in everyone, right? That's an unfalsifiable assumption about human nature, about the way people are. But a lot of us sort of believe something like that to be true. Other people, I think, believe that, most people are terrible. Those sort of things are, I think, kicking around in the background of these discussions. Because and again, you can't really settle that.
No,
because you can't see the world being unconspired, right? If there really was an all-powerful cabal of secret actors working behind the scenes to control everything, the world would look exactly the same,
right?
As if it was just a random bunch of stuff that happens.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, you can't quite, you can't settle that dispute purely by observation. Having said that, you can actually, if you do uncover a whole bunch of conspiracies and it turns out they are happening pretty regularly, then I guess you could verify that, a conspiratorial worldview is correct. But the problem is that doesn't work the other way, because if you say, well, that hasn't happened, the conspiracy theorists can say no, because they're hiding the evidence. So,
Yeah. One of the things that interests me about this and kind of why I got interested in the subject in the first place is just thinking about how we should respond to people who we know who believe conspiracy theories. I mean, I guess probably most people do know some people who seem to be a bit susceptible to this kind of theorizing. And I found myself just kind of not really sure about how to respond to those people. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about that and whether your view has any implications for how we should treat people who believe conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's conspiracy theories and there's conspiracy theories, right? So, I mean, there's a difference between somebody who thinks something relatively benign and harmless versus somebody who thinks that, Jewish people secretly run the world or something like that. There's a real kind of continuum there.
There is, but it often seems to be the case that even the kind of relatively harmless but irrational conspiracy theories, can lead to belief in some of the more harmful ones as well, right?
Sure.
So I think actually, there's a comedian here in the UK called David Baddiel who kind of is interested in campaigns against anti-Semitism, and I think at one point he kind of was interested in the flat Earth theory, right? And investigated that and found that actually even that, in one version of that theory, it's the Jews who are responsible for the fiction that the world is spherical or whatever. So it often seems that if you kind of go further down that rabbit hole, you're going to end up in some pretty dark places, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. There's some interesting disagreements in the literature on this. There's some research suggesting that if you believe one conspiracy theory, you're much more prone to believe others. I understand there's more recent work that suggests that's not the case necessarily.
Right. Okay.
You also there is also this interesting question around, for instance, the anti-Semitic origin of many conspiracy theories versus whether the versions of them today are anti-Semitic or not. So you can tell a kind of genealogical story about something like QAnon, for instance, where there are anti-Semitic antecedents to that kind of thinking.
Right.
And yet at the same time, you can look at QAnon and say there's nothing inherently anti-Semitic about the belief system itself.
Yeah.
David Icke comes in for a lot of this stuff, right? So there's been a lot of suggestion that David Icke is being anti-Semitic. And some people will say, when he says lizard people, he really means Jews. Yeah. And then he's like, no, I really mean shape-shifting reptilians. There's this interesting, but I mean, so it's difficult to sort of disentangle that stuff. On the other hand, you can say there are some fairly benign, playful conspiracy theories. Paul McCartney died in 1964, or Elvis Presley didn't die in 1977, or whenever it was. Those theories are kind of playful and don't necessarily hurt anyone. But there are some which are, as you say, really harmful, really destructive. How do we deal with people that believe those things? I think one of the things that we need to look at, I mean, is how you deal with an individual in your life who believes that sort of stuff. One really good thing to ask, a friend of mine suggests this, and I think it's a really powerful move conversationally, is to say to them, okay, what would convince you otherwise? You believe this thing. What would make you believe that that's not true? Right? Because in a way that puts it back on the person. It says, okay, for you generally speaking, if you're into conspiracy theories, you're probably somebody who takes your own status as a critical thinking, clear-headed knower of things. Seriously, okay, let's put it back onto you. What would you, how are you going to satisfy yourself that this is true? What would count as evidence against this for you? Right? And very often that evidence exists already. But on a social level too, I mean, there's this much broader problem of people's alienation from the knowledge-generating mechanisms of society. We rely upon media, government, academia, industry to generate knowledge for us. We rely on people to know things for us, basically. And so the more kind of opaque, distant, unreliable, untrustworthy, self-interested those entities appear, the more likely you're going to be to distrust them and to think that they're sort of conspiring. So there is that issue, that sort of social issue as well, and that political issue as well, about how people's trust in these institutions. You have to have healthy institutions and trustworthy institutions for that to be for that to be dealt with.
That's really interesting. And there's loads of other questions I could ask you, but I think that's all we've got time for. So, Patrick Stokes, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me. Appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.